Hi folks, I'm International Master John Watson and this is Ask the Master on ICC TV. The main idea of this show is to provide players with a forum to ask questions about chess and the chess world. You can send these questions in advance, or if you're tuning in live right now to the YouTube ICC channel, you can participate on the chat channel, which as you'll see is on the right of your screen. Whoops, I'm getting some feedback here. Let me just get rid of that. There we go. Little feedback, and now I'm back. Always the technical issues. So I generally give priorities to questions that I've received in advance, because that way you can really give me some actual positions, ask more concrete questions, maybe give me some variations. And it's best to submit them during the week, up to the day before the show, but I will be checking them in the morning. Now there's 3 ways to do this. One is to send an email. It's the best way. It's the one I check most often, and it gives you the most convenience. That email is askimwatson@chessclub.com. So that's ASKIMWATSON @chessclub.com. And those I'll get to right away. Then we also have a Twitter channel, which is not used very much, but I do check it. It's #AskIamWatson, same spelling. And finally, you can send to my ICC email, if you're an ICC member, which is you want to send a message to John L. Watson, JOHNL as in lion, WATSON. Okay, so what you can ask about on the show, you can ask anything on the show or make any comments, but the usual things are about chess openings, which I'm sort of an expert in, and I've taught them for many years, chess strategy, the same thing. Leading players, chess books, and videos, because books and videos and strategy are sort of specialties of mine. But you can ask anything that comes to my mind. We've had quite a few questions about training and improvement and visualization, things like that. So right now I'll be looking at the chat periodically. Got a question already. To look at, to answer things. And on the chat, you don't have to necessarily ask directly questions. You can talk to the other people on the chat or just make comments. And maybe I'll comment on them and maybe I won't be. All right, so without further ado, since we always have way too much to do. Oh, I should also say the new indices of the openings are up. That's below on YouTube, below each show, previous shows, all the archive shows, which you can see and are easy to find on YouTube. There's a list of the openings covered, and also I've added a post to the complete list on my Facebook page, which is John L. Watson, and I'll update that every week. So let me talk about some corrections and additions from last week. In a response to one chat question, I was asked about the English defense, and part of the discussion was about which strong players have used the English defense. Let me show you the English defense. It's here, and you can do different orders, but this is probably the most common one. That's the English defense, and after some stumbling around, I mentioned Vaganian and Miles, Short, and Nakamura, but really only Nakamura has played it fairly recently, I think 2013. So I thought I'd point out some other contemporary players, or fairly contemporary, who've used the English defense. And there's really some big names. Hu Yifan, Mamedyarov, Yobava, Ponomaryov, Ivanchuk, Meyer, Eduard, Morozevich, of course, being the irregular player. Many others, such as Bauer, who's a B6 expert, Kangas, Pilavov and Marin. These are very highly rated players, some of them extremely highly rated. So you're pretty safe on playing this on any level. I think that's really the message here. Don't be afraid of playing this because somehow it's unsound or there's some problem with it. You know, if you get to the candidates tournament, you might have to rethink that, but you'll probably, at that point, you'll probably have some other problems to solve. Okay, in response to the chat, I also mentioned the movie Brainwashed. And someone pointed out, English Refugee, pointed out that it was also called 3 Moves to Freedom. Let's see if he's on there. He is indeed. Thank you for that. I looked that up. Anyway, Brainwashed or 3 Moves to Freedom stars Kurt Jürgens, I couldn't remember the stars, as Werner von Basel, and Claire Bloom, who's quite famous in both English and German, as a sort of, and she's a kind of a leading lady who links the hero's past with his present. That's one way to think about it. And Mario Adorf plays Mirko Sentovic, the arrogant world champion. And I don't know if he's a famous actor or not. Also, the other movie I was trying to think of that I was calling Queen something is actually called Queen to Play with Sandrine Bonnaire and Kevin Kline. It's more psychological than about chess itself. I don't think it's a great movie, but it's still interesting to chess players. And the other thing I didn't mention is the TV series Lex, which is a wacko science fiction series and has an episode, a particular episode called The Game. Not every episode is about chess, obviously. And the game is the most accurate and detailed description of a complete game with moves, and a very funny running commentary on the moves by the pieces that I've ever seen. It's really fun. They use the game, a game from Le Bourdonnais McDonald match, and the only thing is it's a little bit gory. It's not for kids under 8 or something, but it's tremendous fun. And most of it isn't gory, but the actual captures of the pieces are a little extreme. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on to some questions from the viewers. As usual, I'll cover some old stuff before I get to the chat. I want to finish off that old question about the person who plays knight f6 against d4, who plays knight f6, e6, and usually c5 if allowed. He asked about the Kali, which we covered. He asked about how to play against the Kali, the London, and the Trompowsky, and what else? The Tori. And maybe I haven't gone through everything, but I did a little bit of Trompowsky stuff. I think that's the most important one of the ones of the material that's remaining. And I found this game that shows a very straightforward line, one that's been pretty popular recently. So this illustrates that. And let me put that game up there. The game itself is nothing special, but I'll just use it as a base for talking about a nice way to play if you're an e6 kind of player. Okay, here we go. So goes like that. That's the Trompowsky, and it's this e6 line because that's what you play. And e4 is by far the most important move. I think we already talked about slower ideas, or at least things that are similar. And if we didn't, we're just gonna. You can't cover everything because that's a huge subject. Black goes ahead and gets the bishop pair, and white goes ahead and gets the bishop pair. And then this move is the most popular, really by quite a lot. The other move, we already saw something very similar to this. And for example, this move, d6, and then if something like this, then the g5 idea. Do you remember the g5 idea? You might stop knight b5 first. You don't really have to. You can play knight d7, knight c6. Knight c6 is interesting, putting pressure on the center or trying to. But generally you're going to play moves like a6, g5 is a big move, and bishop g7 and knight c6 to attack the center. And the timing of that I talked about in my other lecture, but it kind of varies depending what white's exactly doing. So, but in this game, white plays the more popular move, which is c3. And one of his ideas is he's leaving the f4 pawn. He doesn't worry about getting the knight to c3. He thinks it's going to be well placed on d2. And he's thinking about playing f4 early and getting a real attack going with his pawn, since he owns the center. Black has the two bishops, but white has the center. So in this game, black uses this system, and there are plenty of other moves, but I really like this. It's very, very solid. Just play there. What you're doing is you're covering e5 a whole bunch of times. And just when white gets this move f4 in, you play e5. And you can support that with a knight from here, or even a knight from here maybe. And it's hard to break down. The idea is that it's hard to break down black's position. Black is not developing very quickly here, but it's very solid. What he's got is very solid here. And this is the main move. You can play f5, but that's a little early, as it turns out. You might have to look up these games a little bit to get really, really well prepared, but this is basically the idea. Now, in this game, he plays, castles first. Okay, so now white's got everything he wants in a sense, because he's got pressure here, maybe thinking about f5 in some cases, and the pieces are just all nicely actively placed. On the other hand, black has stopped any advance, which makes this bishop less effective, this bishop on d3 here less effective. And now black can catch up in development. So he plays that move. Now, there are options here. Black could simply play this move, is interesting. Definitely worth thinking about, trying to resolve what's going on in the center. Try and force white to play there, because that really means that these pawns are blocking off his attack to some extent. On the other hand, black doesn't have as much flexibility there. Another interesting move, this is kind of strange, but is to play this way. And I kind of like that in a way, because it puts more pressure here, and it covers the key e5 square. And there was one game with this, which actually turns out to be a little bit of a mistake because of this. And then there's a bishop g4 idea too. So in the game he played here, and black took, and I think white took with the knight, and black simply developed and has the two bishops, and white's attack is sort of gone. So it's pretty easy to play this position. He actually played c5 next. Let me show you one more move. He chased this because that's so hard to get to as a weakness, and then simply played here with pressure down the e file and on the diagonal. Two bishops on long diagonals. And it turned out that black stood a little better here. So in the game, black played that move instead, perfectly legitimate. One idea is just to cover this. The other idea is to support the move c5. And white played here. And now black played captures. And I'm going to suggest that a simpler solution is simply to play c5 right away with the same idea. Now if white goes here, it's even better in a way, because at some point, probably immediately, black can play that move and win that beautiful outpost against a sort of a weak backward bishop that's running into its own pawns, a bad bishop. So just for example here, the knight can go swinging up here, and that bishop's free, and this position is very easy to play. So white's not going to do that probably, but what would white do here? Well, in one game white played here, and black simply got ready to play b5 and expand on the queen side. He loved to play b5 and bishop b7, and white tried to disturb the queen side, but black continued his plan that way, and white took over the file, and black played here, a little bit abstract, but not committing to bishop b7 quite yet, because he wants to anticipate that move rook c7 with this move. And now black stood quite reasonably, probably better, a little bit. That was the game Pert Wells British League 2011. Okay, so there's our system. That's our basic setup, that one in the center there. And we got there by playing, it's one way to play this anyway. Got there by playing the first moves h6, then d6, then g6 and bishop g7. Now you could have knight d7 in much earlier than this, by the way. If you're going to play knight d7, you could have played it way before this. Might have even been better, kind of discourage white from advancing earlier. And now get out of the way of the f file and just support the center with that move. Although, as I say, you can make other moves once you've gotten this far. So it's a nice solid thing. You have two bishops and a pretty solid center. And of course white has space, and white's not necessarily unhappy, but at least it's a pretty even game. Okay, that's that one. Let me, maybe before I go to the next one, I wanted to show you the first question for this week that's not from last week. Let me show you, let me look at the chat really quickly. Okay, I have a question. What do you think about e4, c3 for white? Yeah, I remember the first time I saw that was when Fiddler played it against Kasparov. I mean, the first time in a big game I saw that, and I was there, present physically, as a second. And the big idea there is if black plays the obvious move, which for years everybody thought was the normal move, which was simply to attack this pawn, white would have to play here, and that would be passive, and black would be just fine. But since you have the answer queen a4 check, you can afford to play a slow move, and it turned out that's a pretty good one. Because if he takes, you have check. So you might think, well, black can just play anything here and, for example, stop the check and develop a piece. But then it turns out that you can go here, and if he takes it or something, and you still can't take the pawn, whoops, still can't take the pawn, or better not take the pawn. You can actually, but because of queen a5 check, but I think it's just awful. The idea is we still have the queen a4 check idea. And I'd actually have to remember exactly what the theory is here, but you can look this up. This is considered really bad. I think knight d2 just gains too much time. No, then there's queen takes. So it must be knight c3, takes. Yeah, now you have these dark squares, and the queen's misplaced, and sometimes there's checks against the king. Totally undeveloped on this side of the board. This has been tested a lot. Nobody plays this way. So that's the cute little idea. A lot of times black will play this move and just try to get castled so that the queen a4 check doesn't do anything. And white has an interesting option here, which is to get rid of this bishop, even though it costs an extra tempo. I always thought Joel Benjamin showed me this move once, and now everybody seems to play it. And then after that, just set up your pieces without having to worry about blocking your own bishop with the light squares. So that's a little abstract, but that's one way to play it. The question is, should white play this way? Well, there's solutions have been found, and you'll see not that many people do play it. I don't know about the success rate, but that's interesting to hear that it's a good one. Knight f6 h3, okay, that's what Lawrence says here. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know. I guess I'd still play g6. I always thought this line was equal for black, but now this move doesn't make any sense because you can just take it. I guess h3 is trying to stop bishop g4, but bishop g4 is not really a big theme. Somebody played bishop g4 against, I think, Adams or something, and he just lost the light squares and got ground down. So I'm not so sure that's the best theme for black. But anyway, that's just an idea. Okay, what are the basics of the Kan Sicilian? The Kan Sicilian, spelled as in the Donald Trump Kan, C-O-N, and not the Kan, K-A-N. So that could be a little bit of a joke. Great name after the Sherlock Holmes character. I don't know what that means. But okay, so let me see. Kan Sicilian. Okay, well, it's a little bit too broad a question, and we have talked about the Kan a little before. Yeah, there isn't that much to say. That you can't. There's no opening, especially a complex, strange one where black can put his pieces almost anywhere, where you can say that there are just only a few ideas or basics. But I will say there's a couple general themes. If white plays here, which is traditional kind of move, I think one thing worth considering is that these moves stop all forward moves by knights very early in the game. So that's why black can afford to move a little bit slowly with no development here. And that's why. And he can even make some more slow moves, like move the queen. That's the usual Kan move. There are other ways to play the Kan. You can play things like, or the Paulson sometimes it's called. You can also play there and go back either here or here. I think e7 is very interesting. But that's why you can play slowly in this game, is because white it's hard for white to attack. Even if he tries sort of f4, f5, well, he's leaving that square hanging for a knight, an outpost in front of a backward pawn. So that's kind of the Sicilian idea, plus a central majority. And central majorities are very important because white always has to watch out for d5 or maybe e5 followed by d5. So other ideas in the Kan, it's tough to say. There are two ways for black to set up mainly. A lot of times he plays an early b5 with bishop e7 before he does anything else. That's a little risky because you haven't developed your king side, but has been proven over the years to be pretty good. I already mentioned the bishop c5 idea. The main line for years and years and years was this, and maybe still is. Well, I'm pretty sure it still is. And white really doesn't. White can play this move. We've talked about this exact position before, I think. This line, which is what I used to play actually. A lot of people play that. And black just develops his pieces. Knight f6, and then later on he has to decide whether to play very solidly with d6, sort of a standard Sicilian, or try to get something more active going. In this position after g3, he probably is going to play a d6 line, something like this. Whoops. Play here first, for example, and then that kind of move or something. But there's all kinds of tricky things that white can do. Anyway, that's about all I can do with that one. Ooh, someone didn't like the comment about Trump. No, he's just being called that in the press. I won't take a political stand, but that's been one of the names. I'm just joking about the spelling because it's K-A-N in the chess world. All right, let's go back again then. There's no other chat questions yet. All right. So let me go to, I got so many questions to cover here and we'll never get to them all. But here's one from Neil Bridge from last week, I think. Oh no, I think it's during the week. Here's a question about move orders. And it's a very fascinating and popular variation that against the Sicilian Najdorf. So it's, let me just see. Here's the question. I play the Sicilian Najdorf as black. Okay, so that's this. Let me just show everybody that first. We've already talked about the Sicilian a little bit, but Najdorf, but probably not as much as other things. And that's the Sicilian Najdorf. And he says, I like to play against the knight g4 system here. He likes to play that. And he likes to play queen b6 here, which is something I used to teach my students. I'm not real sure if you make complete equality here, but my feeling is that this position, it's very interesting to play this kind of idea. Usually white plays things like here and bishop e3. I don't know how that stands these days, but anyway, queen b6 is certainly playable. And his idea is to avoid the main lines of the English attack, which have to do with going here and getting this kind of attack going. So those variations both prevent white from setting up that simply. But then he asks, what about this move 5f3 to avoid all this? He says it gives white greater flexibility with his queen's knight and his c-pawn. Very true. If it was white's move, he might just play c4. Why doesn't white play this very often? So I've got a game with this. I've actually got 2 games with this. So let's see if we can get to them both. But the real answer here, the first answer is this is becoming quite popular. So they are playing this. It's true that the world champions are not playing this. Excuse me, I'm not getting this game up yet. EX 275. Let's see if that does it. Yep, that does it. Okay, so the real answer is it is being played quite a bit on a very high level. A lot of 2600 to 2650 kind of players, for example. Luke McShane, Zivagintsev, they played F3 regularly, and a lot of people have played it once or twice. And one of the reasons, I mean, maybe it's been given quite a boost, I think, by the book Steamrolling the Sicilian by Sergei Kasparov, not Gary, but Sergei is quite a very strong grandmaster, and he covers it in 240 pages, so he gives it a lot of, let me show you that position again. He gives it a lot of coverage, plus all the options that white and black have along the way. And so what we're talking about is this move. And obviously I can't cover the whole system, it's very complicated. But speaking of players who've used it, he himself uses the names Alexander Olyekin, Paul Kiris, Viktor Korchnoi, and Vasily Ivanchuk. Ludwig Prinz is one of the founders of the system. So let's look at this game. This is between Wroblewski and Aleksich. Black plays a very natural move. White usually plays there. Prinz used to play bishop b5 check. And then black plays here. And I thought I'd show that first because it's the reason that people didn't used to play this way. Now let me say one thing first. If black had played knight c6 first, that allows this idea, this c4 idea. And then if black ends up attacking this piece, it can go to that nice square c2 and come here. So if black's going to play e5, it's nice to play it first. But e6 is very important. In fact, maybe I'll cover e6 now because that's a normal Scheveningen and Sicilian setup. And I think the question is what do you want to play? I'm sorry, let's do this first. What you can do here is you can play e6 now. And as far as a system to play against it, I think this might be kind of nice. I think the question was from black's point of view. And this might be a pretty nice way to play because you just set up a hedgehog position. Now maybe you don't feel comfortable with a hedgehog position, so there's a lot of other options, but I just thought I'd mention that to begin with. It turns out if white plays knight c2 now, which is the natural move to stop d5, black plays d5 anyway because he's got good development. And this is a complicated position, but it's been played a few times and it seems okay for black. This position, for example, hitting there, and if he takes it, you've got that other knight pinned, and you've got the e-file. It's possible for white to try to play for a small advantage here, but it's sure not easy. I think it's dead equal. The line he should play probably if he wants it tries for a small advantage, but I'm not sure if he gets it as this, and then you still play here. That's the plan, is to play the move that white almost never allows in the Sicilian. And I won't show you any more here, but this is almost equal, if not completely equal. You might wonder about g6. Let me show you that one. That's worth looking at real briefly. We're just doing a little survey of f3, but not a very good one because there's so many, not a very thorough one, because there are so many lines. g6 is possible here. And then if knight c3, bishop g7, that looks very natural, but this is actually quite interesting because, let me just show you this. It's very similar to a lot of dragon lines, but white doesn't have to commit to queen d2 yet, because if he plays here, attacking here and seemingly threatening to simply take and start taking everything, white goes here and this capture doesn't work. And the capture doesn't work because of this move, threatening the queen and threatening the knight. And you can work out the tactics, but that just wins for white. So that's from white's point of view with g6. So if you go back, like I say, knight c6, c4, e6 is a perfectly good system, but the more straightforward way to play it is e5 straight away. And then white plays here. This is this game. And now bishop e6 is an interesting move with the idea of a4, a5, a4, and that's been played quite a lot. One of the ideas is to play queen a5. So this is a line you might want to play. Goes like this here, and then white has gone both ways. White has gone here and gone here, often queen a5 is played just to put a little pressure on the center. So that's another system you can use, and I don't think I'll go into too much detail there. Maybe I'll show a few moves. Let me show a few moves here. Let's play the knight. Let's play that move. Knight b1 is very interesting too. And what you're really trying to do is castle. Going to play bishop e7. Let me just make some moves for white, for example. Well, knight c3. One of your plans is kind of interesting here, which is that once both sides get set up, one of black's ideas here, since he does have a little weakness and a little less space, is to exploit the fact that that's a bad bishop. Well, you say, well, that's a bad bishop too. And so what black does is plays there. I don't know about the exact order, but he plays here, and then he plays there, and takes away, exchanges white's best piece, which is that bishop on e3. Fascinating system. White can also play this way and do just fine and play. He can play knight d5 at some point. And okay, now what else? One nice idea for white here is the fact that that b5 is not possible and d5 is not possible. You know, in the Sicilian, they usually get one of those two, and they're gone probably forever. So that's a good sign. Now black can also play a5 right away, and does play. He plays all these moves. But I kind of like white in some of these lines. Even this one, I think the best answer to that, there's 4 or 5 things people have played. I feel like white keeps a tiny advantage with that move, that check. You can also play a4, knight c3. If this move, which is not bad at all, maybe black's almost equal, but I think this is positionally very interesting, grabbing that square. And it's still having a hard time getting d5 in. It's not much, for sure, but it's worth playing if you're the kind of player who likes to play slowly and positionally. So I guess the main move here would be knight c6, and then you just develop, stopping a4, by the way. And, well, both sides just develop. It's considered okay for both sides, but I kind of like white a little bit. You know, there's some vague idea of this at some point, and you can just keep developing. So that's kind of cool. And in this game, to get back to this game, don't want to use too much time here. He plays the most radical line, just breaking in the center. This is why originally f3 was considered bad. And but it turns out after this move, white has pressure. He's threatening to take that pawn. And if black takes, you can just imagine that with the queen down there and the king in the center, that's going to be some problems. So the usual thing that black does is tries to hold on for a while with that move, which is what he does in this game. And then he takes that because you can't take back with the queen. He'll just take this pawn. And takes the pawn anyway. So white is aiming for this very small advantage. If black plays bishop takes, you just go ahead and attack that. Then black better not lose any more time. If he moves the bishop, the queens are going to come off. The king's going to be stuck in the center, and there are going to be these big weaknesses. So he pins first, and then white plays a very good move here, which has the idea of simply castling queenside and having a whole bunch of pieces on that square. In fact, you might even win a piece or something. Well, you'd have a really good game anyway. So black has to do something about that. He plays there, and after castles, just takes. And is that right? If I got that right? I wonder if my timing is right there. Knight c6, takes. Yeah, that's right. And now black usually takes here. I wonder if I can explain that. That may not be so easy to explain. I think, oh, because of knight d5 and the pressure on the file. So he could take this first, but then the rook might take. So why not get the pawns off first and then take this? And there's some beautiful games with this. White tends to, black has no winning chances at all is one thing. Notice this beautiful square here. And there's all kinds of ways. This is a fun position to examine, but I think white's going to have much more fun here. Even though it might, you know, a really good player as black might hang on. Here's one idea. One idea is to play here followed by this. And in this game, real quickly, let me just show you. There was a very nice thing that happened in a simplified position. Here, the rooks came off. And now this pawn was attacked, so here. And then white went here, followed by bringing the king right into the center and attacking that way, and won the game. Now, of course, it's not a forced win, but it just shows you white's ideas. Now, in this game, he did the more normal queen takes, went into that kind of an ending. And white takes and tries for the same position, which is to castle queenside, attack this. In fact, it usually almost transposes, except, well, it can transpose exactly even. This right here, I think it's best to probably just retreat this bishop. And in fact, black can play this line if he wants to. It's just he doesn't have any winning chances, really. So that's been more normal, but now we're back to this problem. This is attacked. White's winning way too much time. White's threatening knight b5. So black has to get rid of this, and knight d5, so black has to get rid of this. And there, no, by the way, and this is the game we're looking at. Should be. Whoops. Let me just see. Oh, he took that way. That's right. He wanted to keep his pawns solid. And just to show you now, look at that f5 and e4 moves. Squares. Sure, it doesn't look like a win for white or anything, but just watch what happens here. These aren't even perfectly exact moves, but they're good enough to show you what's going on. Look at that king getting centralized. And so this position ended up being very good for white. It's not forced, but basically now he gets a little space on the queen side, and all the king and pawn endgames tend to be 1, 2. Now there's going to be a break on the king side is the problem. So for now he brings the king into f5, and all of a sudden the game's pretty much over because these pawns are so weak on that side of the board. In fact, he resigned here. Is that right? It's hard to believe. I just run out of moves, but I don't think he actually resigned here. Let me see. Could have. I guess it's pretty easy because this knight has no moves. Oh, that's it. The knight has no moves. So it goes something like here, here. And now the king has no moves without doing that. And if the knight makes a move, where's it going to go? There's only one. You take it. You come in here, and then black resigns because you're getting passed pawns all over the place. Super. Interesting game. And okay, I guess this is my longest answer today. We have a lot of questions, but this was a very good question, I think, and it's kind of instructive. So let me show you the other one really fast, and then we'll get back to the chat. The other F3 game. I think this F3 stuff is pretty instructive. We always try to do one thing in at least a little bit of depth, and then answer a lot of the shorter questions more briefly, for obvious reasons. Okay, this is Kasparov himself, Sergei Kasparov, versus Borgo, Giulio Borgo, in 2012. Okay, so here's F3, which is what we're talking about, and this time he allows the C4 move. And I wanted to show you, okay, here we go, what black might try to do here. There's that hedgehog we talked about, playing the hedgehog variation, just typical Sicilian. If you're a Sicilian player, which you are if you play this line, this might please you. A nice Geheveningen structure, and this bishop, and maybe you're going to play a6, and you're going to bring the rooks to the center, so you may be used to playing this kind of position anyway. I think it's perfectly sound for black, a little better than the regular hedgehogs. Now, I don't know if these are absolutely the best moves. I like that one. Sometimes this knight goes back here. It turns out it's better placed on d7, but it can also go that way, which I think it did in this game. Yeah, he went back that way to cover the dark squares over here. Now, there's always ideas of d5, for example, especially if you play rook e8 first. In fact, let me go back. I think rook e8 is quite a good move. Let me just show you that, even instead of rook c8. Just here, just play here. And he makes some sort of random moves, like maybe this. Play your a6 move to keep the knight out of the center. And a6 is sort of a Sicilian move anyway, isn't it? And then play here. Well, you could even play, either play like this to go here. That's a standard reorganization. Or maybe even easier, just play here, which puts even more force behind this move and sometimes prepares this kind of double fianchetto. Obviously not quite yet, because that pawn will usually be hanging. It's easy to play. In fact, it's a little more, sometimes white can fall for tactics here because he's defending more space. In this game, we got this knight e5 move, which is a good move, and knight g6. And I think instead of knight g6, maybe get that move in, and clear out that so you can bring your rook over to the center and play rook d8. Just play it safe. Just get all your pieces out first, and then worry about where these knights are going and what they're doing. I think that's the simplest move. Now you can play, well, at this point you might want to just look up some games in this kind of structure and see, but black's doing perfectly okay. So anyway, that's the F3 answer. Went on too long there, but let's just kind of keep moving on. As usual, just a ton of questions to go over. Let me see what we've got here. Yeah, Kan's down in the dictionary. Thank you. Yeah, I was just kidding. Okay, go back a little bit. What do you think would be for c5, b3? Again, such a general question. It doesn't seem to be worrying many people, does it? But let me throw that up there. Okay, so let's talk about e4, c5, b3. Oh, it's just Hard to say. I think everything's okay for black is what it amounts to. There are people playing this fairly regularly, but they're mainly just trying to avoid theory. I'm trying to think what I've done against this over the years. I used to play, in fact, I used to play the Kan Sicilian, so I had to meet this. One thing I noticed once, I think I mentioned this in an earlier thing. We talked about B3 once, and one thing that I noticed, I was analyzing this with one of these B3 experts, and I realized that this move D5 is a little better maybe than it's supposed to be. I think I played this one time, knight here, or maybe one move earlier, but we were discussing it and talking about, of course it depends how white treats this exact position, but that D5, which kind of has a bad reputation, is actually okay. The whole idea of B5 is that somehow white gets D4 in an ideal position, or at least that's one of the ideas, or bishop B5 first. And we looked at this a lot, and there are some problems along this diagonal that can weaken white's king, and we kept getting equality from this. But you can play anything. You can play D6 and then E5. You can play. They're just everything works, but the way white looks at it is, well, I'm equal and it's fun, and a lot of people don't know how to play against it. I don't know if that's still true, but it certainly was true when people first started playing against it. What else did I do? I guess I played this because I was a French player, so I often played that move. Oh, and B6, that's right. I used to play B6, maybe after E6. Because here it's kind of a funny question what to do. He really doesn't want to block the bishop particularly, but he certainly doesn't want to play passively and create dark square weaknesses and cut off his own bishop. And E5 is a big waste of tempo and cuts off his own bishop. So it makes it slightly awkward. That's the idea. The white's best move is undoubtedly to play here, or at least I shouldn't say undoubtedly, as far as I know, to play there. And now we can go back into a Sicilian-like position with knight C6 and knight F6. And so that's another thing I played against this. I think it's a perfectly good system. And you'll find people playing that. Of course, white's fine. White can always play this way. If you want, you're basically just trying to avoid a lot of theory. Yeah, the Prince variation, exactly. It's called because of Ludwig Prince, who played it differently. Here we go, F3. What are your thoughts? And the Tony Miles verdict on Eric's book, well, I think it was a mean comment, but I don't think I'll repeat it on air. It's been very popular. Poor Eric, who's written some very good books, has been suffering from that comment ever since, because when one of his books comes out, everybody quotes it. Tony Miles was very critical. Tony Miles was also not a very stable person, so you could argue that his opinion is not always completely reliable. I think that particular book was awful. It was the whatever it's called, the Frankfurter Dracula variation of the Two Knights Defense, with the crazy long line, and it was a sloppy book. But Eric's written a lot of good books. All right, what else do we have here? Okay, no more chat, and that gives me plenty of time to look at what people have sent me, and there's so many of these things. Well, here's a question that someone might have some opinions about. He says, as an experienced coach who knows others, could you give someone who's never had a chess coach your take on coaching online? And then he says, Skype perhaps offers the most interactive setting. Okay, so I think that online coaching is actually superior to face-to-face in many circumstances. It's fun to be face-to-face, but for one thing, there are fewer distractions online. You don't have any real what can your student do except stare at the screen? And if they're doing something else, you can usually sense it pretty quickly. So there's fewer distractions. It's easier to concentrate for both sides, and you get much more study done in a shorter time because of the nature of online study, which allows you to, for example, you don't have to reset the pieces after every variation. That takes a long time. You also won't reset them to the wrong position because it's all computer checked moves. I mean, you can't make illegal moves or the wrong ones. You can just go backwards to get to your position. So it's much faster. You can even switch from game to game really quickly. You don't have to get a piece of paper out or a score sheet and wonder where you were, none of that sort of thing. So that's a major thing right there. You have the ability to make arrows, and for example on ICC at least, well, let me just say I combine ICC with Skype to do most of my lessons. I sometimes have done lessons on chess.com. Those are the two I know best. On ICC, which I'm using right now, you can do all kinds of things simultaneously. Both sides can take over the board, show things, make arrows, identify squares. So you see that this arrow here, and if I'm talking about this square being weak, I can just circle it, that kind of thing. And you notice I've done that on my show. I'm on ICC right now. I know there are several other platforms that you can do lessons on, so I'm not trying to give an exclusive here. I'm not sure if they all have as many bells and whistles as ICC and chess.com, but maybe somebody wants to suggest one on, maybe someone wants to suggest another site on the web or another way of teaching online lessons. But to me, ICC is great. I mean, you do have to be a member, so at least at some point. So there may be some free ones, but I love this setup. I think it's a great setup. And most teachers will use it, actually. Okay, in the context of playing against 1d4, I was asked my opinion about the soundness of the Chigorin Defense. Okay, so here's the Chigorin. Really, really fun opening. And I've actually been asked about this a few times now. And I think maybe partly that's because I wrote the first major book about, the first serious and full-time, full-length kind of book about the Chigorin Defense. But that was about 35 years ago, so you can imagine it's not really up to date. I also wrote some very serious articles on that afterwards. And then fairly recently I did a set of ICC lectures with the repertoire on the Chigorin. So you might want to check that, because if I thought it was completely unsound, I wouldn't have given it. I certainly wouldn't have given this set of lectures on it. And as far as books, mine is obviously way out of date. And there are two other fantastic books. One is Valery Bronznik's really masterpiece on the Chigorin. It's, I don't know how long it is, 350 pages or something. And there's a German edition, but also an English edition, which is actually more up to date. It's revised, so you want to get the English one. And on it, and I helped him a little with that, so I know he did a tremendous job. And I reviewed it on Twik if you want to look at that. And it's pretty much encyclopedic. It gives kind of like all the lines. But then there's Morozevic's very nice book about his own experiences. He was number, between 3 and 6 in the world or 8 in the world, I guess, for that time period. And it's a little bit less systematic, so it's not really a repertoire builder per se, but it's full of wonderful games, and you can pretty much form a complete repertoire out of it. The amazing thing about Morozevich is he did so well against top players like Anand and Kramnik and Shirov and I believe Ivan, just about everyone, because they all knew he was going to play it, so they could all prepare. These are the people who have computers and they're 2,800 players, and Morozevich did great, probably better than the average opening. So I think that's absolutely, it says something good about Morozevich, but it also says something good about the Chigorin, that it's not easy to just knock out when everybody knows you're going to play it, all these great players, and then he did fine anyway. Now, as for the theory, I think it's still sound. I think it definitely favors white in some slow lines, but by very little, no more than most openings favor white. And there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of people, well, there's a lot going on with this line. And if they're there, and that's, I mean, in terms of people saying, oh, the Chigorin's no good, this is often recommended. That old line, giving up a piece, is a little bit under the weather. I never really liked it that much anyway, but the idea is to win this piece at some point with the move. Oh, excuse me, b4, my fault. b4 traps the knight, and then that move still attacks the knight, and eventually good things happen is the idea. And and there's a way to give up the knight for 2 pawns, but it doesn't work very well. And this used to be thought to be pretty solid and good, but I think it has some issues too. I think that move's a little better than its reputation. So what I recommend in my repertoire, which I think is just fine, is going here first. Now this used to have a slightly bad reputation, but now it's got a pretty good one, so it shows how things go. And at this point, white can transpose into the big old main lines, which go something like this, hitting d4, he defends d4, and black plays this move. White takes, black plays here. And this is the line that Morozevich had to defend as black against the top players of the world and did fine. And I think it's still doing fine. So those lines are okay. And so are the main old bishop g4 lines doing fine. These. Now there's a lot of side lines that you have to really work hard on to know what's going on. But these basic lines, and this is a famous thing where white can either just take back with either pawn or take here and take a big center in return for the bishop pair. These lines are theoretically doing fine for black. So what I recommended in my book, The Strategic Opening Repertoire for White, was not something to give a big advantage. It was just something to get a game and maybe get a small advantage. And it's here. Now the only good move is this, and then this move. I also gave bishop g5, by the way, as an alternative. I gave 2 moves. I tend to do that in my books. So I give that as a possibility, and I also gave this. And this is a way to play for white that's safe, that doesn't require much study. Obviously, you're just getting your pieces out, playing e3 uh, and getting a game. But on the other hand, black's getting his pieces out smoothly and is considered to be pretty much okay here. It's just maybe it's a tiny edge for white, and that's all you want. So Chigorin Defense, is that pretty much what I wanted to say? Oh, I was going to say that even Magnus Carlsen played the Chigorin a couple of times. He had a helper, Dag Sudholt, who was a big Chigorin expert, and they studied it. I believe he drew Kramnik, for example. And, black, drawing as black is okay in this kind of, at that level. And I should go back and take a look at that. I can't remember for sure. But the main thing about the Chigorin, the big negative, is that you really have to learn a lot because there's a lot of tactical lines. Things are really opening up fast. I mean, even in the basic, the most basic thing of all, which is to take this and then protect here and then go ahead and attack the center and then start rolling your center pawns forward. I mean, you've got to know some theory here. Okay, I hope that's enough for that one. Let's get back to the chat maybe. You think the chess.com arrows? I kind of do too, but it's still a pretty good way to have a lesson. John, in your opinion, what are the most obvious must-read chess books for the ambitious player? Well, it depends on your level. You also it depends on whether if you're an incredibly technical, scientific, ambitious player that wants to read technical books or whether you want to enjoy yourself, hopefully both, but I think that limits the books too. I don't know if there are any must-read books. I'd have to think about that. Anybody got any ideas for a must-read book? There's all kinds of classics that you can read, all kinds of tournament books and games collections. Yeah, it's really good. It depends how strong you are, but it's really good to play over some games collections, I think. I always recommend Anand's. Maybe you want to get a player though who matches your openings to some extent. You don't want someone who never plays any opening that you play because then you aren't learning quite as much about the structures in the games. But as far as really good books, Anand's book, I love for attacking players. I love Shirov's Fire on the Board. There's 2 volumes of that. And that's for in biographies. His Gelfand biography was terrific. His games collection was really good. And there are all kinds of those. If you read my book reviews on TWIC, they're free. You'll see that go to the review archive, and there's 100 and some of them with multiple books in each one, sometimes as many as 8 or 10. So there's all kinds of reviews. You might want to kind of browse through those and see what sort of appeals to you. Obviously, opening books are very specialized, so I wouldn't mention those. There's some tremendous tournament books. This one just came in. Yeah, Zurich 53 is one that was just... Najdorf's version was reproduced. I've never liked Zurich 53 by Bronstein very much. I think it's kind of superficial, and I don't know. It tells a nice story. If you want to have fun, it's a book that really inspired people. I think one of the main reasons it inspired people is because it was available broadly when very few books were about chess generally, much less tournament books. So the best Zurich 1953 book, in my opinion, much better written and much more interesting and much more analyzed and more background and more bios of the players, is the one that just came out by Russell Enterprises, the one by Najdorf, which he wrote at the same time as the one by Oiva and the one by Bronstein. So I would recommend that book if you're going to get a Zurich 53 book. It's a wonderful book. Of Mice and Men. Yeah, you could read Of Mice and Men. That's a good one. Wow, I haven't seen that book in ages. So it is a great book, tremendous book. Steinbeck generally was underrated. Danny Gormley's new book sounds interesting for a view of life on the struggling chess player. Yeah, a lot of people really like that. I heard some people that thought it was a little bit. You'll probably understand this sort of too much, but yeah, sure. But I don't know if that's a must-read book in the sense of an ambitious player, a person who's trying to improve. It depends what stage of your career you're at, probably. What are some other must-read books? I mean, I used to read, I read everything. I love history books and games collections, and I'm just drawing a bit of a blank. So why don't you throw some books I think on the chat. You guys should mention a book or two that you think's really, really good. Trying to think what... See, the problem is the opening books, I really recommend a lot of them strongly, and I really recommend against a lot of them. But the problem is, of course, it depends what openings you play, and that's getting a little bit silly. Endgame books are kind of dime a dozen because they're all pretty good. It's very easy to write an ending book. I always liked, in the old days, Smyslov and Levenfish, but it isn't even computer checked, I guess. I like Fundamental Chess Openings as a general endgames. Fundamental Chess Endgames is a general endgame book. I think that's an excellent endgame book. Strategy books, Well, Gelfand's new book is really good. Of course, I've got recent books on my mind, but it's fantastic. His book, Positional Chess. Um, what else? There's some basic classics like Oiva's middle game book, that kind of thing. Um, there's fun books that can also teach you a lot, like Jonathan Rowson's books, Seven Deadly Chess Sins and Chess for Zebras are excellent books. There's beginners books. I'm assuming you're not interested in those anymore. Yeah, Sarah My Games Against the Champions is great because it's a games collection, and yeah, and it's a really excellently written book. Boy, you want a recent games collection? Walter Brown's book. It's just he played so many incredible and wonderful games. That's a book worth thinking about. Good recommendations. And okay, and if nobody has any other book record, just keep putting them on there, and I'll turn and notice that. Off the top of your head, which players in chess history do you consider best at playing and maneuvering in closed positions? Okay, one thing that occurred to me is you can look at a player's black openings to guess whether they tend to play or have to play for their systems some closed positions. Because, you know, when you're white, you don't really, you're probably not going to make first moves that force a closed position. You might, but it's a little bit less indicative of what people do, because black has the chance to mix things up and play crazy things, and then it's a little hard to close the position. But French players and King's Indian players are often going to end up in closed positions because of the pawn structures, which are pawn chains. And I also think E4, E5 players tend up in quite a few closed positions, really closed, not just semi-closed, but actually pretty blockaded. And but also a lot of semi-closed positions. And then there are some Nimzo Indian players who, because of bishop takes c3 and c5 blockading, you get these sort of blockaded. Many Nimzo Indian variations are, they'd probably be called semi-closed, but other ones are pretty locked up. You might even call them pretty much closed. You know, if you play moves like if you play things like against white's playing d5, c4 here, and black's playing, and maybe there's a pawn here, and black's playing this way, well, that's going to be that against that. That's going to be a pretty closed position, and essentially closed, and the rest of the board can get closed too. Then there's also openings like the Czech Benoni and the Old Indian, and even the modern defense that can get closed. But anyway, as for specific famous players, I thought of course, Nimzovich, who managed to lock up positions a lot, much more than any previous player, I think, more than Steinitz, more than anybody, and play all kinds of brilliant piece maneuvers. He just excelled in those positions, and he was less comfortable in open positions, just unquestionably. His greatest games are from closed positions. Botvinnik was excellent at close maneuvering in usually sort of semi-open, semi-closed positions, and but he also had completely locked positions. He was very good at. Of course, he's good at everything. And Petrosian is the most famous one who enjoyed closed positions. He has some of the most famous maneuvering games in history. So some of the stereotypes about closed and open games associated with certain players are probably true. Bronstein sometimes locked things up, had fun with maneuvering. Most of the greats, though, were kind of open lines, activity, space kind of players. People who really enjoyed having some room for their pieces and enjoyed, and I think a lot of that, and a lot of them played to avoid closed positions. For example, Capablanca, Elyekin, Smyslov, Tal, Fischer, Spassky, and probably quite a few others. And I think really the main reason for that is not so much that open positions are good or closed ones are bad or anything like that, but it's a practical matter. Closed positions are just more difficult to play. They take a little more time in the clock usually. The open lines, maybe the guy with the open lines has a few more tactical ideas. I think it's a very practical decision because the closed positions I mentioned are all perfectly sound, and great players have done very well with them. So it's not that. For example, I can't really think of any examples from Kasparov of closed positions. He really avoided them. I'm sure there are some good ones, but they don't come to mind. And Karpov was famous for positional chess, and yet he really liked to have space and he liked to have open lines. So they weren't particularly closed positions. They were just ones that were sort of static in some sense and required long-term planning or some brilliant sort of maneuvering. I remember when he played e4, which he did the first half of his career and all the way through the Spassky match, he had trouble in a couple games against the French that got closed, real trouble. And he played open lines against the Chigorin, for example. The English opening, he grabbed a lot of space, and also he liked the English opening. He liked to play against the King's Indian with a very classical e4, c4, d4, and kept the position fluid a lot of times. So then it comes down to modern players, and I think there are even fewer that really like to lock up the position. I think Carlsen can do that and has done that, but of course he's good at everything. And I notice Aronian seems to do this, especially from his e4, e5 openings. Of course, there's the Marshall, which is open, but he also plays traditional e4, e5 games that are he's very good at sort of locking everything up and finding wonderful maneuvers and playing just really well to get little advantages. That would be an example with me, and I actually don't know enough about him to know if that transfers to other openings, but it's very impressive stuff anyway. So let me see what we got here. Do you advise to learn the Spanish system Chigorin Breyer Zaitsev to a 1900 player? Wow. Kind of depends on what kind of positions you want to get. You're going to run into a lot of Berlins and things like that. Now you won't be able to necessarily get to that because there's Marshalls and Berlins and things. So you need to know a lot to do that. In other words, you're trying to get to the classical Ruy. And it's wonderful to learn. It's one of those basic things that's really good for black to know for sure. You're trying to get to this position with this stuff, and then maybe, sorry, let's get that move in, sorry. And then, for example, this, and then after that, playing things like the Breyer or this kind of thing, or Rookie 8, Smyslov's. What else did you mention? The Chigorin, where you play knight out and c5 soon. So that kind of thing. I didn't play Rookie 1. No wonder that looks so stupid. I was kind of wondering how that could have been. Yeah, so we have Rookie 1 first. And then you can play like this maneuver, or you can play the Chigorin. That's the Breyer. Or you can play the Chigorin. Or, and these things. I used to know these things 25 moves deep, and now I don't know them at all. But then there's many, many alternatives that are like that. The Zaitsev is really fun. Line. That's why it starts with bishop b7, and so it's more active because you're getting your pieces out really, really fast. You can always play Smyslov like that, or throw that in first. Carries, knight d7. So that's great, all said and done, and you would learn a lot if you can get your players to play this way, but you do need to know a lot. And I don't know how much background you have with e4, e5. Oh, as far as a book, I'm sorry. I think if you want a little bit of activity, the Zaitsev book is excellent. The one, what's it called? The two Swedish authors, Johannesson, I think, and it's a few years old, but it's wonderful. It recommends the Zaitsev system. So just look for Ruy Lopez systems. It's a Gambit book, Gambit Publishing, which makes it easy to find. And that book's great. The Breyer is always around. The top players really love the Breyer. You don't have that much space. I'm not really that thrilled at 1900 of being that cramped, actually. Even with the Chigorin, you got a little more space. I would play the Zaitsev because you kind of get your pieces out actively. So I think that would be the one of those three. But here's the problem. I mean, for example, against this, you're not going to get your closed positions, are you? You're going to get some sort of d4 thing, or you're going to get the famous ending if you want to play into that. This thing, and so that's a problem. And the other problem is you get as far as the you're right about to play your closed system, and suddenly, sorry about that. What am I doing? Knight f6, and you're all ready to do this, and then suddenly we get a position like this. Now you can also play the classical, by the way. It's another interesting position, which can be sort of semi-closed. And you get to one of these positions where suddenly black, I'm sorry, what am I saying? I'm talking about black's choices. So you have the option of doing these things as black, of course. My fault. I was just tired today, I guess. Yeah, no, you could do that. That's right, because you don't have to play the Marshall or the Berlin or anything like that. That's black's choice. Wow, I'm really not thinking. Yeah, so what are the drawbacks, or what are the other ways white can deviate? I mean, they can play d3 systems, of course, but you just have to learn those anyway. That's no big deal. Yeah. So actually, you can get to those positions relatively easily. Of course, white can play, the Gioco Piano and the Scotch game, but you're going to have to know all those things. The four knights, I always like kind of the four knights. I noticed it came back recently. Someone won a nice game with it. So sorry about that. Yeah, of course you can play those lines, and I would recommend the Zaitsev. I think that's the one to try. Sorry about that. Yeah, the marshal I wouldn't think would be a good idea for a 1900 player because it's too stereotyped. Well, this is, I think, a general rule about chess: is don't play an opening where you have to play the same moves for the first 10 moves every time, or very, very similar moves. For example, the King's Indian attack, and the marshal's like that. You're playing all the same moves, you're doing the same attacks, you're not really having to think much. And if you don't have it memorized, you're going to lose, and if you do have it memorized, you aren't learning anything. The war owl is white. That's a good point. Thank you. It was mentioned that you would have to learn the war owl, which has to do with Queen E2, for example. This Queen E2. There's two Queen E2s. There's one where you play now, and there's one where you play it next move. You do have to learn that. But that's not much, is it? Not that many people play it, and it's not that. It's fairly easy to learn. So yeah, if you feel like it, and if you have fun with it, if you like maneuvering games, go ahead and play the closed Spanish. That's fine. Just have to learn your sidelines. And my apologies about the limitations, because I was wrong. If you want another closed system, G6 is getting pretty popular. It's kind of fun, and you don't have to learn as much. That's always nice. I'm not a big fan of closed systems for people that are lower rated because they take a lot of work, and you don't get any fun. You don't get any quick games. For example, if you're playing in a tournament where you want to save your energy a little bit and beat some lower players quickly, boy, it's going to take a long time to win a quick game with the Breyer or the Chigorins. Okay, maybe I should move on then and get to my next thing. Oh, the same questioner has asked the last question about the closed positions. Asked, for what level of players is Sergei Shipov's The Complete Hedgehog useful? Same exact answer, actually, and/or what thoughts do you have regarding it as a book selection? Okay, so the Shipov book, which is awfully old now, but one nice thing about the Hedgehog is it doesn't change that rapidly. Now, there's so many ways to get to a Hedgehog that, well, I'll just throw one of them in. For example, here, this kind of moves, and then fianchetto this way. And here we are in a Hedgehog system, and the way you make it sort of an official one, the one that Shipov is obsessed with is, I think, actually, am I thinking of the Shipov book, or am I thinking of the Suba book? Oh yeah, maybe I don't know how good the Shipov book is. That's interesting. But anyway, this, for example, is one of the classic positions of the Hedgehog, and black puts his pieces like this. But I was going to say the interesting thing about this is I just talked about it. You have a tendency to play all the same moves, all the same moves for quite a while, and then maybe it's kind of hard to switch into middle game mode and do it well, and you're cramped. So when you're a lower player, maybe you don't want to be this cramped. Now, the flip side of that is you might just want to learn the Hedgehog because you're going to learn it anyway, probably as white and black, and it's very instructive. But as a teacher, I certainly don't encourage the Hedgehog. It's a pretty sophisticated opening, and to the extent that you make stereotype moves, you're not really learning anything. And then later, all of a sudden, you have to make an unstereotyped move, and you probably don't know what you're doing. You can get into trouble. I actually have never had a student, I don't think, yeah, I have, but I've had very few students that played the Hedgehog. And that wasn't just my doing. Somehow it's just a coincidence that I haven't run into so many of them. I think the Shipov book is a little bit old, but I'm not sure about that. Someone might give me a year. No, yeah, the Zaitsev, you can repeat moves if black plays that order. But I think you can get Zaitsev positions without repeating moves. You're right, that's a big issue with the Zaitsev, but I don't think, let's look at that. Boy, you're really testing my memory this time, and my alertness. I have to probably wake up. Where was my coffee? Let's look at that. I think you can play a different order and then still be okay here. Let's see how that works. Let's just look at these moves. And rookie 1, sorry. I'm going to skip that one again. And let's just say we go straight for Zaitsev. And here, and castles, and here. Yeah, that's with rook e8. Well, certainly with rook e8 right away, you have to deal with that. Now, Smyslov used to play h6 right away, by the way, which would allow you to play rook e8 next. And so there are order issues. I think the Zaitsev officially, unless I'm wrong, it starts with this first, right? God, what a terrible memory. And then after this, yes, you can do this, and it turns out none of these fancy ideas of f4 work. And so if white wants a draw, you really can't play rook e8. But I think you can get there somewhere else. Does anybody help me with this? Can you play h6? Then you're not quite in the same position, are you? Excellent point. Yeah. Yeah, I know in the book they talk, of course, about this. Nothing else really works. There's no sacrifice. The bishop f7s and knight g5s and f4s are all fine for black. But surely here you have to go back again. I think they give an alternative way of trying to get a Zaitsev-like position. And I apologize that I just don't know what that is. But maybe you know. Does anybody know? Who asked that question? Korea, yeah. Yeah, I don't know, Francisco. Do you know a way of avoiding that? You might want to look at that book, because I think they have something else. I mean, if need be, you can play it more like a Smyslov system and play h6, which I don't know if, formally speaking, is going to end up being. I guess it isn't, is it? It's not going to ever be a Zaitsev, formally speaking. Excellent point. So maybe that's not the system you want. If you think really you're going to be playing, a lot of people are going to play this kind of system for white and yet still just want to draw. Seems unlikely to me, especially because they can't count on you playing the Zaitsev, right? So they're very unlikely, I think, to want to draw in this kind of position. And you could switch. That's what you can do, and that's what people have done as black. Now that I think about it, okay, this is sort of coming back to me. So maybe you try that once, and if they really, for some reason, want to draw, and they know about a draw, and they think they can get it, well, just play one of the other systems. You know, play h6 kind of moves. I think there's a queen d7. There's always the carries set up like that, with the idea of playing bishop f6. So I would say against a player who's that chicken and that worried about taking a draw on move 12, there are better openings to try and force a draw. Maybe just switch into another system, and don't think it's going to be a major problem. But my apologies for not knowing a really good answer to that. King d7 probably wouldn't work, but queen d7 has been played. Yeah, thank you for that. How's our time doing? Whoops, getting short, but let me see if I can get to something else. This is a very long answer. Okay, any other questions? If not, I'll try and quickly start this last question that I was sent. I like to get to as many as possible. Keep sending me questions. Email me those questions or ask me on chat. If you emailed me those questions, I will get to all of them. I haven't gotten to all of them, but every week I try to. Here's a quick question that maybe isn't. I think maybe I'll skip this for now. He's asking about this, and maybe I'll get back to that. It's not absolutely horrible. Usually people's ideas with queen e7 are to play this kind of structure, sort of a Philidorish kind of thing. c6, well, for example, after that move, you're probably going to play c6 pretty early to stop knight d5. It turns out you don't actually have to, but it's probably the main system people are looking at. So they're still looking at playing here probably, and d6 and c6, and white's supposed to be better, and we can maybe look at that next week. Let me real quick show you something about this kind of line. Let me see if I have a game with this now. Somebody asks about the symmetrical Sicilian, and what order you're using is, there's so many ways to get these positions, but basically he's asking about this kind of position with g3, g6, here, and the traditional line going way back is to play castles, d4. And black has this option of playing into a King's Indian defense with this. And one of the ideas here is if white plays here, which is not a terrible move, but getting the queens off is no big deal, because black can retake with a rook and stay active. Now white also has all these other ideas, these knight e5 ideas after this. Bishop e3 is a very famous move. Bishop e3 attacking this. White has won games in these positions, but black has figured out how to play them basically. So the main King's Indian line is this, and then you guys may be familiar with this position. White sets up with this and b3 and bishop b2 and maybe rook b1. Black sets up with a6, rook b8, and b5. So you could play this with white, but you have to learn a lot, which is the point of what the person asked about. So then in my book, my books plural, for example, my Mastering the Chess Openings 3, which is entirely about the English opening, I say, let's play this first. And I've said this for years, actually. I put it in my old English books, too. Instead of castles, play this first. And he's saying, well, but you still have this problem, and you might have to go into a King's Indian defense. But I'll show you why that isn't true. And I might come back to this next week, because it's fairly complicated. But basically, now white has this option of taking here, and now there's no rook takes. King takes exposes the king in the center. You're never going to do that. So you're going to play here, and then white has all kinds of nice ways to try and get an advantage here. Just this move is a good start. But, well, I'll just show you a basic sequence, for example. That almost forces that. And then you have here threatening this, which looks artificial, but turns out to be a problem because the bishop is attacking the rook indirectly. So you get something along this line, and you get a small advantage. I'll show you that next week because we're really running short of time here. But let me just make that point. Okay, so that's kind of the main point. So he says something about to avoid the d5. Oh, and just for the record, you could also just play here, and black has nothing better than the main lines, but neither does white. This is attacked, and it's true that you can't take it yet because of queen a4 check, but it makes no difference because black's just going to castle, and then you're going to have to, you've transposed, you're going to have to defend that anyway. So I don't think there are any deviations there if white plays d5 instead of taking. So the question here had to do with Kramnik apparently wanting to play the move 5 d4. Now there may be another reason for him doing that, because I don't believe, first of all, if black plays d6, I don't think there are any advantages here. I don't think white's gained anything here. And if white takes, it's very similar to what we just looked at. And isn't white going to play bishop g2, and isn't black going to play bishop g7, so you've got the same position. So I don't see the advantages to playing d4 first, but I see it as an advantage over playing 7 d4, waiting 2 moves to play d4. I don't know what else he could be looking at. What is he trying to avoid? Because this is the main line. Oh, I should have mentioned this. The main line ends up in one order or another being this position, the old main line. And I think most people, like white, I describe in all my English opening books, but in particularly that volume, why I think white is better in this position. And people tend to avoid this a little as black. It's pretty tough to play for black. So what is white doing that's different from 6? It sort of implies that he's worried about, let me see, this position. He's worried about black doing something else here, maybe d5 or something. Maybe for some reason d5 is better when the bishops are out. I find that a little hard to believe. Maybe there's something like tricky. I think people did in the old days try this, but I don't think it works. It's a real weird tactical idea. I find it a little hard to believe that there are, but there may be some concrete thing that people do now that, maybe there's some clever move, I don't know, that makes this a little more difficult than playing 5 d4. So I don't see anything wrong with 5 d4, but I don't know the point of it yet. But the main point is that 5 or 6 d4, which is what I've always recommended, does at least avoid black just going here, because you always have this endgame. In this position, you don't have, the endgame is kind of harmless because the king's not stuck in the center and the knight didn't have to retreat. The rook's on a nice square there, so that endgame isn't worth very much. But the endgame with the king still in the center favors white. So that's the answer to the question. All right, so now do I have other questions? Karpov Unsker is a wonderful game. Okay, I may have missed something in the chat. I will copy it over and look at it for next week. But thanks everybody for listening and participating. I love it when you say stuff and talk to each other in the chat. You can talk about, great comment on the Worrell. I never would have thought of that. Mention books and things. And you can even ask me about question books right online and right as we're chatting. And hopefully you got something out of this. What I try to do every week is give some fairly simple answer on something, some fairly straightforward thing, and then something a little more complicated and instructive. I also think because there's more advanced players, it'd be nice to get a few more questions about main lines, some particular main line. But at the same time, we're going to see a lot of things about slightly irregular moves and fun moves that people don't know much about. So I want to kind of get to that balance. It takes time to work this all out and get this really working. But tell your friends about it and think about sending a question beforehand. Remember the email, askimwatson@chessclub.com. And then also remember that you can always message me on ICC at John L. Watson. And finally, you can hashtag AskIamWatson on Twitter. So thanks everybody for contributing, and great questions. Keep them coming. If you aren't too interested in the kind of questions that I've been answering, if you feel like, oh, I don't play this or this isn't so interesting, send me something you do play, and I'll make sure that I get to it. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.